Welcome to the Bastard Show.
I don't know if this is going to be the first or second installment of the LGBT Discourse. Yeah, so this is going to be its own part because there's a lot going on here.
A lot of ground to be covered.
As I'm going to say it in the other part, the LGBT community is kind of on fire.
Yeah.
We're always fighting with each other, and it's over stupid shit.
Absolutely ridiculous, helps no one in the end, sort of garbage.
It's just obnoxious at this point, and nobody's letting each other live. Like, the amount of gatekeeping is obnoxious. I've decided to address that. I didn't want to address this one by myself because I feel like a trans person should do that. This is Eli.
He just yanked me off the streets.
Craigslist.
Yeah, exactly. It was a Facebook ad, one of those really bad sponsored ones. Trans person with one brain cell.
Trans person that knows how to use Google.
Exactly, that's my qualification here.
Their pronouns are they, them, they're non-binary. They've experienced gender dysphoria before. I'd like to say, first of all, like I do in other videos, if you are a douchebag to the LGBT community, this video isn't for you. Just fucking leave.
There are spaces for you. This isn't one of them.
Just fucking leave. You're wasting our time and energy, and I will delete comments because that's what I do if I see them.
Good God, I love deleting comments.
Oh,
I love
God.
when people are like, I just want to have a discourse.
And you're like, no. And as for the cis people that are staying, you might be confused, but you also might learn something.
I'm gonna try to break this down as best I can. So this video is discussing the medicalization of transgender experience as it has been popularized since roughly the early 2000s. Mostly in social media circles. I used to be really involved in this discourse when I had an active Tumblr, and now that I don't, I'm not, because it really doesn't exist outside of Tumblr. Very similar to the asexual inclusion-exclusion debate.
Which I'm going to address.
This doesn't really matter in real life, you know? This discourse doesn't really matter outside of the internet. However, it's got some fundamental principles that do impact the community as a whole, and it should be addressed.
Some of the comments on my gender video were disheartening, I guess. There were a lot of true scum. It was just mostly trans people doing that, and it was so disheartening. Like, I left out the whole true scum debate in that video for a very specific fucking reason.
Because I'm here, bitches.
Because this video I knew was going to be made, and the thesis, you don't necessarily need gender dysphoria to be trans. Take it away.
Alrighty, so some definitions for the generally uneducated watching, which don't worry, we all were at one point. Gender dysphoria is a medical term used to describe the intense, distressing disconnect between a person's body, that is their perceived gender, and gender as assigned at birth, and the gender they know themselves to be. Usually, dysphoria is framed in a very physical context. Disconnection between how one believes their body ought to look in a gendered context versus how it does look and how the world reacts to that body. But there are also elements of dysphoria that are social, such as names, pronouns, gendered interactions, honorifics. People who identify themselves as trans medicalists, trans fundamentalists, or true scum are people who believe that in order to be transgender, a person must experience gender dysphoria. On the other side, too cute and true scum are both words that were coined by a transgender woman on Tumblr in like fucking 20 something or other, I don't know. They're Tumblr terms. People who are anti-trans medicalists or too cutes do not believe that the presence of gender dysphoria is necessary for a transgender identity to be valid. So my qualifications: I'm a non-binary transgender person who does experience dysphoria. I've had 4 years of semi-college level medical classes through a college and high school uniting medical program, and I know how to use Google. So we decided to take some of the biggest points that we know of to exist within this discourse. There are probably a lot more points, less argued, smaller, less developed in nature. We took the big ones. So the first point, the one we encounter most often, and the most viciously argued point, is that the science says all trans people experience dysphoria. No, it doesn't. I'm legitimately wondering where this point came from because it takes very little research to find out that most experts agree that you don't need gender dysphoria to be trans. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of these two doctors, Dr. Jack Drescher and Dr. Jack Pula, any asshole named Jack with an MD they found for this article, published by the American Psychiatric Association, a Q&A on gender dysphoria from these two medical doctors. The question asked here of relevance: is there a general age that people realize they are transgender or experience gender dysphoria? Can it happen late in life? These two doctors agree that, quote, not all transgender people suffer from gender dysphoria, and that distinction is important to keep in mind. Gender dysphoria and/or coming out as transgender can occur at any age. But don't just take those two assholes for it. What do they know? Medical doctorates are for weenies. Take a look at this quote from the National Center of Transgender Equality. Quote, for some transgender people, the difference between the gender they are thought to be at birth and the gender they know themselves to be can lead to serious emotional distress that affects both their health and everyday lives if not addressed. Gender dysphoria is the medical diagnosis for someone who experiences this distress. Not all transgender people have gender dysphoria. On its own, being transgender is not considered a medical condition. Many transgender people do not experience serious anxiety or stress associated with the difference between their gender identity and their gender of birth. So right off the bat, we have two legitimate medical sources that agree that you don't need to experience gender dysphoria in order to be trans. And this also begs the question, what kind of dysphoria? Because the medical definition of gender dysphoria is very broad. Intense, distress-causing disconnect. People experience dysphoria a lot of different ways, in a lot of different contexts, and brought on by different experiences. No two people will experience being transgender the same way, and thus they won't experience dysphoria or lack thereof the same way. For myself, I used to have a lot of dysphoria with my chest. I shouldn't do this. Sorry. That sort of came to a close once I unlearned the idea that boobs are inherently female and only belong to women. Like cis women have some sort of monopoly on titty. Titty. Copyright cis women. I do think gender dysphoria, a certain amount of it, can find its roots in socialization and the things we're taught from a very young age growing up in a cis hetero-patriarchal society. God, that's a mouthful. When you grow up in a world that's cis, you learn cis ideas, and you take them to heart, and to brain, and to spirit. So we've established what gender dysphoria is from a medical perspective. While we're on this medical topic, and I'm going to go more into this with the subset coming up, which is what about the brain scans? I will say that this popularization of medicalizing transgender experience is a pretty recent thing. It's grown with social acceptance of transgender existence in general, but it is worth saying that this wasn't really done before colonial medicine became the main form of medicine practiced in Western countries. I have this book called Medical Apartheid by Harriet A. Washington. If you like anything about social justice, racial justice in particular, and/or medicine, that's required reading. It's a phenomenal book. I love it. But the first chapter is all about how medicine developed in America through any branch. This is how dentistry developed. This is how dermatology developed. This is how gynecology developed. And it all originated with slaves. White physicians, which by the way, physicians were only allowed to be white, would practice medicine on slaves long before it ever saw a white person. Already, we have these issues with how our medical system and our facilities, institutions, and treatments have come to be. Western medicine icky. We haven't removed it from the system yet. To this day.
White people think they can define medicine.
Exactly. The way medicine has developed in Western society, it's very racialized. It's very divisive within gender populations. Medical discrimination is a real thing, and it's been around for a long, long time. It has not yet exited the system, and this is a part of it. The medicalization of bodies and experiences that are not considered normal or majority or understood, it's used to oppress them further. Medicalization of transgender experience is actively harmful to transgender people.
Basically, Western medicine,
Icky.
if you consistently cite Western medicine for all of your arguments, your argument is going to fall
inherently
apart.
flawed.
Yeah.
When you cite the findings of an institution that has made its legacy on the backs of marginalized people, that's not a very good argument. And I know you're going to say, well, that's the only medicine we've got, and it's the most advanced. No, it fucking isn't.
Western medicine icky.
Western medicine icky.
So, back on my gender video, I said specifically it is an abstract concept of human identity. I did not specifically say that it has to do with the brain at all. It is kind of hard to define what gender is. With these trans medicalists, all they do is cite the brain.
The brain.
As to how trans people exist. But the brain. Your brain scans are bullshit.
My gray matter. Fuck off. It's
about,
all the same.
What about my cerebral cortex?
My amygdala. So the brain scans we're talking about, for those of you who have no fucking idea what we're on right now.
Crack.
It's always been popular to look at the differences of the brain between different social groups. But as medical technology has advanced, and as we've gained the ability to look inside the organs and look at how they move in real time and in exposure to real stimuli, it's become very popular to speculate, is the brain different in different groups from a very inside the brain perspective, instead of just looking at it from the outside and making guesses, which is how we used to do things. A lot of people cite that you can use a brain scan and examine how the brain reacts to stimuli, things like volume of gray matter, the shape and size of brain structures like the hippocampus and amygdala, and the receptors for sex hormones in the brain. You can use that all as evidence to determine whether somebody is male or female. No, you fucking can't.
You really can't.
You really can't. I'm looking at this article right now from Stanford Medicine, published in spring of 2017 in the Sex, Gender, and Medicine magazine. There are differences between brains in different people. The sizes of the amygdala and the hippocampus are different. The ways in which our brain lights up when we are exposed to stimuli, such as very emotionally charged images or readings, it's different in different people. And the way this article has framed it is that it's different between sexes. But the reality is that those differences emerge based on what sex hormones you're exposed to in utero. Why are men and women's brains different? One big reason is that for much of their lifetimes, women and men have different fuel additives running through their tanks, the sex steroid hormones. In female mammals, the primary additives are a few members of the set of molecules called estrogens, along with another set of molecules called the progesterones. In males, testosterone and a few lookalikes, collectively deemed androgens, are the fuel. Importantly, males developing normally in utero get hit with a big mid-gestation surge of testosterone, permanently shaping not only their body parts and proportions, but also their brains. In general, brain regions that differ in size between men and women, such as the amygdala and hippocampus, tend to contain especially high concentration receptors for sex hormones. Sex hormones.
Sex hormones.
Men and women.
Men and women.
Not synonymous.
Nope. Like I said in the video, secondary sex characteristics are important, and they're all fucking different from one another. We don't all have the same level of anything.
We're not all born with the same soups. No two cisgender men will experience the way their brain interacts with testosterone. It won't happen the same way. It's not a uniform process that happens in uniform quantities. The connection between hormone and sex is inherently flawed because there's a lot of things that determine how much testosterone, estrogen, androgens, progesterone you have in the first place. It can be determined by a lot of different things. Right now I have a study that states that it's racial differences in testosterone. This examination of black cisgender men and white cisgender men found massively different testosterone quantities among racial groups. And that can be said for a lot of different populations. Hormones are inherently tied to various medical conditions as well. For example, PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, results in a lot of hormone fluctuations that include high testosterone levels in cisgender women. So a lot of cisgender women will experience, in addition to, cysts on the ovaries, hence the polycystic ovaries, many cysts on the ovaries.
Wow,
they
English.
experience very irregular menstrual cycles, very light menstrual cycles, facial hair, acne, low voice. That all sounds like dude. But they're not. It just means high testosterone.
Their brains could be different, like bigger or smaller in different areas than other cis women, but that doesn't mean they're not a cis woman.
The point we're trying to make here is that a lot of different things impact, how much of a certain hormone your body will produce, how it will use it, when it will use it.
And if hormones are the reason your brain is a certain size in certain areas, then it doesn't have anything to do with gender, it's just hormones.
Hormones are not inherently gendered. Our brain has different soups, and that has little to nothing to do with our gender. So yes, it's true. You can take a look at two different brains and you'll notice that they're different sizes and shapes. But that's because of how much hormone we have, where it's used, and how it's used. Nothing to do with our gender.
In the other study that we cited last time, basically only 10 of the 116 brain areas that they tested had any patterns with
Linking
gender.
among gender. Looking at a study published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America. It's called Sex Beyond the Genitalia, the Human Brain, published in 2015. And it looked at, specifically focused on matter of a fucking volume of gray matter in the brain among people of different genders. And it used data analysis, it used SI imaging, and the hypothetical distributions of male end regions of gray matter and female end regions of gray matter. The general findings was that there's very little consistency which regions light up between women and men. We all have an overlap. Our brains are like mosaics. We all have traits associated with the masculine brain, the testosterone developed brain. And we all have traits associated with the feminine brain, the estrogen developed brain. So once again, these brain scans imply very little about our genders, only about what we were exposed to in utero. Sophie Searcy, hope I'm pronouncing that last name right, is a data scientist, and she wrote an article about this whole concept of brain scans and why we don't need them to confirm transgender identity, saying, quote, "Indeed, it is not only the existing literature on sex differences in brain imaging likely biased, but recent work does significant damage to the idea that there are separate, distinct male brains and female brains at all." A research group led by, hope I'm pronouncing this one right too, Daphna Joel, summarizes the findings of their meta-analysis that included brain images from 1,400 participants, 1,400, that's a lot of participants. Quote, "Brains with features that are consistently at one end of the male-female continuum are rather rare. Rather, most brains are comprised of unique mosaics of features, some more common in females, estrogen brains, than with males, testosterone brains, some more common in males compared with females, and some common in both." So when people say the brain scans can be used to determine whether or not someone is transgender, it's first of all subscribing to the inherently flawed idea that our brains are gendered at all. Our brains aren't gendered. None of our organs are. They're simply exposed to different soups when we're developing.
So you can't use the medical field and the science field to specifically define what gender is.
The idea of sorting marginalized bodies has only ever been used for bad. There's nothing good that comes from trying to stick our bodies in different boxes, because what comes out of that? What insight do we truly gain? Sure, our bodies have different soups, and that means they have different shapes and sizes. Nick's amygdala is bigger than mine. So what? Why do we need to focus on it, and why should we ever tie our identities to it?
Basically saying you need gender dysphoria to be trans.
It subscribes to a lot of medically denounced ideas, both from a psychiatric perspective, from a neurological perspective, and the entire idea of trying to sort our bodies based on experiences and factors that we can't control goes way, way back to the general practice within Western countries of privileged populations wielding science, however they define it and use it, against marginalized populations.
And without their precious brain scans, trans medicalists have no argument.
Exactly.
Okay, now define gender with your brain scans having been debunked.
Do it, cowards! While I'm here discussing Western medicine and dysphoria as it's been defined through, this medicine that is based on the oppression of different bodies, I will bring up that cultures around the world have forever recognized genders outside of the male-female dichotomy.
And they don't need gender dysphoria.
If you go to pbs.org and you do a little searching, you'll find a map of gender-diverse cultures all around the world. For most of the world's existence, for as long as society has existed, lots of us have heard of Two-Spirit existing within various Native American tribes. And it's different for all indigenous tribes, of which there's like fucking more than 600, okay? But all across the world, I'm looking at this map right now. I see Sub-Saharan Africa, I see Australia, I see Indonesia, South Asia, Europe. There's one in Ukraine. Here's all across Polynesia, the United States, Canada, heading down into South America, all across the world. Genders outside of male and female have been recognized, and so few of them rely on this very Western idea of disconnect between body and mind. Rather, they value the synchronization of mind, body, and spirit. I was reading an article about the Mahu, indigenous Hawaiian gender existing outside of male and female, generally recognized as a spirit that is both male and female. They are valued and respected in traditional Hawaiian culture because their gender fluidity is seen as an asset. The ability to embrace both male and female qualities is thought to empower them as healers, teachers, and caregivers. This ability also helps them when it comes to navigating life's challenges. So much culture that's not white embraces non-female and non-male identities without embracing the idea of distressful disconnect. And that's not to say that gender dysphoria should not be discussed, recognized, and treated. I'm just saying that it shouldn't be the defining quality of transgender experience. Within this discourse, we hear so much discussion about dysphoria, but never about euphoria, the elation one feels when the gender they know themselves to be is recognized and embraced. Why isn't that medicalized the same way? Why hasn't the DSM recognized euphoria in addition to dysphoria? Why is there so much focus on suffering and disconnect of marginalized people?
And that brings up a whole new logical fallacy within these people's arguments is...
You can't have one without the other.
You can't have one without the other, but what happens when you don't have gender dysphoria anymore? Are you no longer trans?
Exactly.
What's the scale here? Do you need gender dysphoria your entire life? Only once? If you're going to define people like that, you need to define your beliefs. You can't just say things.
Of experiencing dysphoria do you become trans? How do you measure that? How do you quantify someone's distress and or elation in certain contexts in exposure to certain situations? So yeah, dysphoria is a very Western idea, based in Western medicine, based in concepts that different bodies are inherently fucking different soups, man.
And bringing up different cultural genders not only helps to destroy the argument of trans medicalists, but it also keeps transphobic people from using this video to be transphobic. Us saying that the brain scans are bullshit is not saying that trans people don't exist. They fucking exist. They've existed for millennia. How can you...
Long before the word trans existed.
How can you sit here and tell me that trans people do not exist binary and non-binary when they've existed in cultures for longer than religion. So I will not have transphobic people using the brain scan arguments against trans people. We don't do that here either.
Not allowed in this household.
Don't be a dick.
Don't be a dick.
And that'll be usually my main argument. People ask me on the gender video, then what is it? All you said was it's an abstract concept. All you said was it's an identity. Yeah, that's the only way I can define it.
Gender's so unique. I took a class in high school all about American diversity, and one of the units was about gender, and the first thing the teacher asked was, what's gender? Everyone answered differently. If you Google gender, every dictionary you look at, every medical paper, every philosophical paper, every article written by people of different genders will say something different because gender is so unique. It's fluid. It changes as we grow, as our body changes, as we learn more things. And no two people will ever experience gender the same way.
And these people existing for millennia since humans could...
Since fucking forever, dude.
Since fucking forever. Obviously there's something there. That's always the argument I'm going to use, is just because we can't touch it and see it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Because if these genders have existed since people, there's gotta be something there. We can't just say that it's fake or that because we can't physically see it, that it isn't real. We just can't define it. We don't know what it is. Just like we don't really know what the hell dark matter and dark energy is.
Dark matter and trans people are one and the same.
How does it feel being a very powerful force of the universe?
So the next big argument that I hear often is non-dysphoric transgender people are taking resources from dysphoric trans people, which begs the question, what fucking resources? I will use the idea of a person who identifies as trans, who has breasts, who does not experience chest dysphoria, versus a transgender person who does experience chest dysphoria. And let's discuss the resource of top surgery, double mastectomy, getting rid of titty. So a non-dysphoric trans person who does not feel the need to alter their body in a gender-affirming way. What fucking resource are they taking from the person who is seeking out top surgery?
They aren't.
They aren't!
I feel like that's the end of the discussion. They just aren't.
Like, if they don't feel the need, they won't take it.
You're
Nobody's going out pursuing SRS for shits and gigs.
That's like a major surgery.
That costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. So many appointments. So much confirmation from therapists that, yeah, you're really trans the way we define it. So much healing. So much change in your life. Nobody's doing that for shits and giggles.
And they're like trying to talk about like trans trenders, which don't even fucking say that.
It's not a fucking thing. Like,
yeah, don't even say that in my
If you think you're trans,
direction.
but later you realize you're not,
Oh,
that
wow.
doesn't mean you were,
You're a
fucking-
human.
we don't know ourselves
They're
that
trying
well
to figure it out.
for most of our lives. Exactly. Experimentation and exploration of one's gender, and with labels like transgender versus cisgender, that's not a bad thing. It's not like you're putting on a costume just for shits, although don't get me wrong, some cis people do that. Appropriation of marginalized identities is a very real thing. I don't really think that there is a large enough population of cisgender people who are consciously pretending to be transgender for the purpose of denying credibility and resources for actually transgender people. Within the topic of denial of resources and denial of credibility, it always begs the question, other than just what resources, which also begs the question of, is it happening with non-tangible resources too? Like support and acceptance? Is there a limited quantity of that? Can we only accept people who meet a certain criteria that is totally arbitrary and not medically supported? And if so, why are we doing that, you know?
And let me tell you, I don't think there is a limited amount of testosterone and estrogen to go around. I mean, the only thing that might be limited or affect trans people significantly would be the surgery thing because of wait times, right? But they aren't getting surgeries. They aren't, I'm saying on a general basis, aren't getting surgeries, aren't getting hormones. So I don't know what your point is.
Some of these surgeries are very openly available for cisgender people. For example, imagine you're a transgender woman who has taken estrogen to deal with your gender dysphoria. You've been on estrogen for like 3 fucking years now, but you still experience chest dysphoria, and so you decide to pursue a breast augmentation. That process for a transgender woman will be very, very different and much harder than it would be for a cisgender woman who just wants to go up a cup size. Both are very valid pursuits. I do believe that people should be allowed to surgically alter their body because it's theirs. And like, if you're paying for the service, then you should receive it. But the surgery at the end it's the same. It's the exact same result being performed on the same part of the body, you know? Why is it so much different for cisgender women versus transgender women pursuing it? Because transgender people are so fucking medicalized. The denial of resources that's often being discussed is because transgender identity is so medicalized to begin with. There are plenty of cisgender people who do take hormone supplements for a lot of different reasons. Birth control alters your hormones. Medical disorders like PCOS, like we discussed earlier, like androgen insensitivity, like low testosterone, those happen to cisgender people all the time. But pursuing hormone supplements for them will be a very different, much easier process than for transgender people. And that's because trans people are so fucking medicalized.
And trans people themselves in the comments will try to be like, well, what if they have to go through a process? Because what if they're making a mistake?
If we stop insisting that dysphoria is so fucking necessary to be trans, then people who don't naturally experience dysphoria will feel less pressured to fit this narrative. And it is important to say that this narrative
and there won't be
does really
mistakes.
negatively impact trans people. I unfortunately don't have the article pulled up here, but I read an article written by a transgender person who was seeking medical transition about their experience trying to seek first validation from psychiatrists, which is a required step before actually getting the surgery. Standard will vary state to state, country to country, but generally, you need at least 2 psychiatrists to confirm that you do have gender dysphoria disorder in order to seek medical transition. This person was describing, as they were talking to their psychiatrist was going back into their early childhood, trying to say like, did you always feel like a tomboy? Did you hate dresses and the color pink? Trying to assert this narrative that being transgender is always present from childhood because of the way the brain develops. And this person was like, no, I thought dresses were fine. I liked the color pink. I liked playing with dolls. It was later in my life that I knew I was a man. And the psychiatrist said, well, I'm sorry. That's not consistent with the diagnostic criteria required for gender dysphoria. I can't sign you off for this transition. And so this person had to seek out a different psychiatrist and manufacture a story about their childhood to fit into this diagnostic criteria in order to seek transition.
Not only does that police how trans people,
Exist.
trans people's existence. It's forcing gender roles on people, gender expression. Like, there's just so much fucked up with that. I don't even know where to begin.
I can neither confirm nor deny how widespread this is, but it is safe to say that there is a general narrative that is accepted for trans people. You know, from a young age, just inside, like you're a tomboy, or you're a fucking mama's boy who doesn't like sports, shit like that. That's what we generally think of to be a trans person in childhood. And that's the media portrayed narrative. That's what's accepted in medical circles. So yes, there is a denial of resources for transgender people, but it's not because people who don't hate their boobs exist. That's why it's so much more valuable to accept when a trans person expresses their gender. It's so much more valuable to accept that than it is to say, but what about the brain scans? You'll notice I'm returning to this point a lot because it's all very connected.
That's why it's difficult to talk about.
Exactly. It ends up going in a bit of a circle because it all stems from the same place. You could write a fucking book about this and it would have to do with class, it would have to do with race, it would have to do with culture. All this stuff ties into gender and transgender people and how they are perceived in medical circles, how they are perceived in social circles, and what it has to do with dysphoria. But the general point is that medicalizing trans people actively harms the way they are able to move through the world. Some people say if we get rid of the gender dysphoria diagnosis, then we also get rid of a transgender person's ability to seek out procedures that will be covered by insurance companies. I'm not suggesting that we toss out gender dysphoria as a diagnosis because it exists, and it does impair people's abilities to function in their daily lives.
But that's just it. It's kind of a disorder.
It's a disorder. Being trans
Isn't
not a disorder.
But gender
Having
dysphoria is. And people will be like, Nick, you said in the past, definitions should be changed if it's harmful. Here's the thing, lads. It's not harmful if you don't think you need dysphoria to be trans, first of all. Because if you say you need dysphoria to be trans, and gender dysphoria is a mental disorder, you are helping the right wing.
If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And if you find a way to make some trans people acceptable and some trans people not acceptable, people who hate trans people to begin with will take that idea and run full speed with it.
They will tell you that you are a disorder.
Exactly.
By what you've said.
They'll find ways to twist words. They always do and they always have. For example, body dysmorphia disorder is a disorder. Having a body isn't a disorder, though. Do you see what I'm kind of getting at here? That separation between an experience and an experience that causes you significant distress?
As I was saying, like, I say that you changed the definition, right? And even if we needed to change the definition from a disorder to just a trans experience, which you don't need to, the issue that still stands is the symptoms of gender dysphoria are way too similar to that of body dysmorphia, other than the obvious differences. I have body dysmorphia disorder, and whenever a trans person would talk to me about their gender dysphoria, the similarities were kind of, wow, we're experiencing the same thing but not the same thing. Mm-hmm. They're obsessive disorders. They take over your life. Sometimes it's more in a mild form. Sometimes it's more in an extreme form. So we can't just sit here and say, okay, let's change the definition from gender dysphoria to not a disorder, because it is. That's just the nature of it. It's an obsessive disorder. Not being trans, but having gender dysphoria. With the behaviorisms that come with gender dysphoria, you can't tell me that it's not a disorder. The similarities between my experience and that of a person with gender dysphoria is too close. The only difference is it has nothing to do with gender, and it's just body hatred for me.
We both had uncomfortable experiences with our bodies for different reasons. Moving into the last point, God, that was a horrific angle. Non-dysphoric transgender people worsen the credibility of transgender people as a whole. Do they really?
Do they?
Is that the reason people don't take trans people seriously? When a 14-year-old high school cis male says, I identify as an attack helicopter, is he doing it because he truly understands the differences between a person who experiences dysphoria and a person who doesn't, and because he aligns himself with trans medicalists' belief? Or is he saying that because he's been socialized to believe that transgender people are just crazy libtard lunatics? What's the more realistic outcome here? I did my research, okay, and I found the origin of the 4chan meme where the phrase I identify as an attack helicopter was first fucking used, okay? 2014. Quote, oh yeah, well I identify as an attack copter. If some dude can decide he's a lady, I can decide I'm an attack copter. Case closed, crack open the lulz. Where did you hear about dysphoria in that quote? Is that why our community isn't being taken seriously? Which, by the way, taken seriously is a code word for denial of resources and social acceptance. Institutions such as, for example, the United States military, which is no longer accepting recruits who identify as transgender and or have had any degree of genitalia surgery. There is no higher up within the United States military who has decided to eliminate transgender people from their pool of recruits on the basis that there are transgender people who don't experience dysphoria. They've done it because that's how institutions have always done things. People who don't immediately align with privileged majority populations, whether it be ability and disability, whether it be gender, race, ethnicity, language, national origin, they've always oppressed and created these rules and structures meant to continue marginalizing these communities for as long as they fucking existed, okay? The United States government does not continually deny resources to transgender people because there are 15-year-old trans people on Tumblr who don't hate their boobs.
They don't hate you because of non-dysphoric trans people. They hate you because they're transphobic.
And it's always been that way.
The idea that you need to conform to the Western concept of gender dysphoria to please certain liberal cis people is so messed up in its own right.
Another way I've seen this sort of pattern occurring within marginalized communities, for example,
Internalized oppression.
I've seen occurrences like someone will post about an experience they had being catcalled and they had a witty response for the catcaller. And if I go into the comments, inevitably I'll find people who are saying, "That was really rude of you. You should have just told him no and been nice about it. This is why people don't like feminism." People who have witty responses to catcallers are not the reason men, as a majority, dislike modern feminism. They dislike modern feminism because it requires them to cede power and privilege to a group they have always been marginalized. Trans medicalists, listen to me. Cis people don't hate you because people who identify as niche genders exist on Tumblr. They hate you because they've been taught to, because that's the way our society functions. And it all ties back to race and how various races and ethnic groups have had genders that, colonists couldn't wrap their fucking minds around, so they turned to extermination. Think about indigenous Americans and two-spirit genders. People don't say, "I'm an attack helicopter," because they genuinely have an understanding of gender dysphoria. They say it because they think trans people are a joke as an entire group, okay? It does us no good to turn in on one another and say to each other, "It's because of you. It's because you don't hate your boobs enough to pursue top surgery." That's why they disrespect us. The same way it does women no good to say it's because of you. It's because you called a catcaller a fuckhead. That's why they oppress women. No, it fucking isn't.
It isn't. That's literally the right's manipulation tactic, is to get people to turn in on one another.
Respectability politics, internalized oppression, tone policing. I understand that desire to look within a community and say, what are we doing wrong? How could we better conform to the narratives and assumptions of privileged groups and try to place ourselves in proximity to them and say, perhaps if we function in a way that's easily digested by privileged groups, maybe we'll get some of the rights they have. Maybe if I pretend my childhood is the way a cis psychiatrist thinks it ought to be, then I can better pursue medical transition. The issue with that is not how the trans person grew up and experienced their childhood. It's the cis psychiatrist's understanding of what it means to be a transgender child, and how gender changes as a person ages and goes through puberty. It's never the behavior of a marginalized group. When a black woman expresses anger when faced with racism, it's not her anger that is, the cause of the racism.
It's the racism.
It's the racism that's the cause of the racism. It does a community no good to point fingers at each other and say, this is the reason oppressors oppress us. It does do us good to turn outwards and turn to the oppressors and say, stop it. The reason transgender people have lacked credibility and been taken as some sort of fringe group joke for so long is not because they're 15-year-olds on Tumblr who dye their hair and use neo-pronouns and don't hate their boobs. Don't lick cis boots so much. If you fit into a cis person's understanding of what it means to be trans,
Doesn't make
you
you better.
won't get cis privilege. It won't get easier for you. I want everyone to close their eyes and imagine a world where anti-trans medicalists don't exist. It is a generally accepted belief and an enforced belief that a person must experience gender dysphoria to be trans. Imagine that world. Transphobia will still exist. You will still be part of a marginalized community. You will still be denied rights, acceptance, and resources. Things don't get easier if you try to conform to a privileged group's beliefs of what it means to experience a certain marginalization. Proximity to privilege doesn't give you privilege.
It makes you a suck-up. They aren't going to give you rights just because you lick their asshole.
When you get down on one knee and put your tongue to the boot, they're not gonna give you rights. They think they understand you better then. You've enforced their understanding. Transphobia will still exist, even if you believe trans people need dysphoria to be trans. How does it help anyone to point fingers and say you need dysphoria to be trans? Who are you helping? So far in 2019, nearly 20 transgender women have been found dead as a result of homicide. Has this helped them? Has this helped transgender women who have died in ICE custody? Is this helping transgender people across the world who are fighting for their lives?
Tell me how this gatekeeping is helping.
What good does it do for the community? And if it doesn't do any, why are we still doing it? It's not medically supported. It's not going to give you rights. It won't give you proximity to privilege.
And overall, filled with logical fallacies.
Why? Why do it?
We both know logically it's mostly white, trans, mask
individuals. I do not know that I am trans because I have experienced a disconnect between my gender and, the shapes my body has assumed. I know that I am trans the same way a cisgender person knows they are cisgender. Gender is a very intuitive, self-informed identity. It does change and it is fluid, and sometimes we don't know what it is. Sometimes we have to try on different labels and see what feels right and what best aligns our mind and our spirit. I've known I was transgender for about 6 years, but never was that because of a hatred or intense distress I felt in my body or in my social interactions. Simply knowledge I possessed. Trans medicalists' beliefs are not supported by actual medicine.
Trans medicalists smelly.
Trans medicalists smelly.